let's talk about Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, the second book in the First Law trilogy. So I'm going to give a completely non-spoiler summary of my thoughts for people who haven't read any of the books at the start of this, and then I'll go into a non-spoiler discussion of this book, but there will be some kind of implicit spoilers for the first book, The Blade itself, which I have a review for on this channel. So if you want to check out what I thought about that, go and find that. The complete non-spoiler summary is that it's got very respectable prose. It's one of the tidier modern fantasy series for its prose quality and in some ways for the structure of the book. It's got very good character work, famously very good character work. That's what Abercrombie is known for. There's a significant expansion and growth in the major characters who continue on from the first book. There's real psychological realism, I guess, about how they are, how they act, and there's unvarnished, excellently written action. On the other hand, this one's a matter of taste, I suppose. It's sometimes pretty gory. The biggest problem, though, is that the plot is vestigial. I suspect the whole trilogy will have the same amount of plot in, over the three books compared to one Brandon Sanderson book of this length. It's really that there is a lot of interesting stuff that happens, but it happens slowly over the course of, so through this section, not much happens to that group. They just wander around, that sort of thing. The plot stretches out to give space for character work, but it does mean sometimes the material, rather than emotional stakes, are abstract or thin, and some people are really going to dislike that. But I liked it. Basically, I liked the book. I'll continue on to the third book in the trilogy. So here, spoilers kind of coming for the spoiler review of book one, but not of book two, so still non-spoiler. There are the same 6 point of view characters that there were in book one. There's Logan Ninefingers, there's Glocta, there's Jezzel, and Dogman, Major West, and Pharaoh. Though now it's not so much that there are three main characters, and then there are these kind of three lesser characters who have occasional POVs. They are all fairly important. They all have I haven't measured. I think that Jezzel and Logan and Glocta get slightly more than the rest, probably still, though Pharaoh particularly comes up, but they all have much more similar amounts of space. So Baez is going to going to the west, to get some stuff to deal with Khalul and the Eaters and the Gurkish Empire, and so you get Jezzel, Logan, and Pharaoh narrating that from their quite different perspectives. That's quite an interesting kind of mixture of characters. You have the Dogman and Major West in the north, dealing with Bethid's invasion of Angland, and they both have different stakes about it, but they end up kind of both having to deal with that. Major West gets sent over with the army as a staff officer. Glocta is mostly in Dagoska, where he gets sent, I think, at the end of the first book. It's a city in the south under siege by the Gurks, and they're being manipulated, of course, the Gurks, by the corrupt mage Khalul. So that's something where he has to deal with an internal pressure, internal threat to do with treachery, but also an obvious external pressure or threat. So you've got a traditional, the plot threads are clear in that sense. Baez is leading a traditional quest to the west, and there's a kind of, we need to get somewhere to get some stuff or some assistance for this big enemy. And Glocta he's got the internal threat, external threat thing, and in one way it's therefore an extension of his first book. I'm investigating crimes or corruption in the Union, but it adds on this other military thing which harks back to his military past, of course, but there's a massive dissonance with who he is now. And there's this military narrative in the north with two soldiers, Dogman and Major West. But this being Joe Abercrombie, nothing much happens, as I've already said, at least by page count. The stuff that does happen is cool, it does matter. He concludes plot threads well. I think the idea that his plot is bad is probably the wrong way to put it, because often the stuff that's happening is interesting and it concludes well. It's incredibly slow. And there's real change in certain things, I should say, from the first book to this book, and from the start of this book to the end of this book. But the plot is sometimes vestigial. The strength here, as in the Blade itself, is, I guess, the prose to a degree and the characters. So the prose is, he writes easy, flexible prose. It's evocative in its way. His description is sometimes very good, in terms of it's just very nice and pretty, but mostly I'd say, more than anything, it's very clear and robust. He's not really a big landscape writer, sometimes he is, but it's more that the way he describes the places his characters are visiting, I think often helps reflect the psychological reality of the character, and their perception of things is really effectively done. The psychological reality of their experience is really well done. Now, some of my commenters, a slight tangent, take the view that he's boring. Abercrombie is boring. So when I'm saying, oh, his prose is good, his structure, as I said, is kind of okay. Compared to Scott Lynch, it's much more traditionally structured. The reason people think it's boring is because of the lack of much plot. You know, he finishes his plots well, but they're glacial, I've already said that. And that's because he's interested in character. So the character, character readers love him. Plot readers hate him. I think that's pretty comprehensible as to why people feel like that. There are significant arcs of character development from the beginning of the book, and from the beginning of the trilogy as well. And they're much more significant than the respective plot developments, as much as the plot developments aren't nil. Jezil actually has to face real crisis and danger, and that is a bit of a kind of existential crisis for him. West is stuck as a chief aide in a situation that's really hard, and so he's got this tension between his strong sense of duty and decency and his more, his more practical, savage side. This kind of man who is also a born warrior of some kind. And even where there's not development, the characters aren't really... And Dogman, similarly, you have a development from the start of the first book where he is really not an outsider in the group, but he's really a man apart in some senses within his group, just getting on with his scouting, to having to take more and more responsibility now that Logan's gone, and with Rudd Three Trees leading these named men south. On that note, yeah, characters like Rudd Three Trees, he's really good. I really like him, one of my favourite characters to this point. Lord Marshal Burr is a really rare kind of character in this subgenre, and is really well accomplished, I think. Baez is fascinating in terms of, I think you don't come away thinking from the first two books, oh, the guy's just, he's just purely good or purely bad. In fact, you probably are like, oh yeah, no, I see his point, I see where he's getting to, kind of hope he deals with these weird guys. But there's always this and he does cool stuff, but there's always, because he's basically the only person who uses outright naked magic as opposed to subtler things. But there's always an ambivalence about his character and about his judgment, not in terms of is he insane or making very stupid decisions, but about whether or not his secretiveness is serving good or bad. And perhaps above all, and this is the big thing I want to say about his character work, is that his character work morally impresses me. Now, what I mean is this. Joe Abercrombie's not really Lord Grimdark, and so some people will be like, well, obviously he's not, that's got to go to a backer or whoever. But he's not Lord Grimdark in the sense that this isn't a nihilistic, awful world in the way people say. The characters aren't all narcissistic maniacs or pure victims of faith who don't know what they're doing. His sympathy, his anthropology is sympathetic. It's humane in nature. It's much more humane, for instance, than I think George R.R. Martin. As an author, he's real compassion for the characters he's writing, for the awful flaws in his characters. And I don't mean he justifies or tolerates them, like, oh well, he's a terrible guy, but that's okay. But rather, he has an ability to draw out the tortured, self-destructive urges and actions his characters sometimes undertake or feel, and which map onto our broader human experience that most of us probably know. To look at that sort of error not with blithe tolerance but with real compassion is a rare gift, I think, in a writer, and Abercrombie does have that. And he also sets up a Gemmell-esque, and is it notable that he's often seen as a successor to David Gemmell, he sets up a Gemmell-esque measure of virtue and character. You act within the constraints life puts on you. You do the best you can with what you have. You are not able to kind of sort out everything. You just do the thing that is in front of you. In Druss terms, you fulfill the iron code, I guess. And you see that with Dogman. You see that with Three Trees. You see that with Logan to a degree, who is a man who can shape reality around him to some degree, but is still ultimately ruled by circumstance. You see it with Lord Marshal Burr. Abercrombie opposes the great man theory of history, yes, and some people have said this is very much a kind of series of books aiming to push away at the idea that there's this one man who can shape everything, or this great man. But he doesn't disbelieve in great men. Forley the Weakest from the first book, he is a great man in Abercrombie's view. You just have to adjust your expectation so that you are looking for the right sort of hero, I guess. Now I'm continuing on to the end of this trilogy. I have started Last Argument of Kings, though it's priority below Red Mars at the moment. I don't know if I'll continue beyond. I'm not against the idea. I'm also not kind of wildly passionate. Give me your thoughts about that in terms of what's good going forward. Is the second full trilogy good, for instance? Anyway, what did you think of this book of Before They Are Hanged? Tell me in the comments. Till next time.